Agile and DevOps and look at how these things overlap or don't, you know? And it's interesting. They may seem like different things, right? And in fact, when I worked on, we did a lot of research for a paper we produced on this topic, and I worked with another guy who specializes in Agile, and we were really looking at where the differences are. And what we found was that Agile and DevOps fundamentally align on some of their goals. And when we started looking at that, it made a lot of sense. And it's really a good way to look at things, because when you start with the why, like not just do DevOps to do DevOps, not just do Agile because it's what everybody's doing, but why are you doing these things, right? You start to get some really interesting answers. And what we found that basically both of these are things which people are doing to drive better value to customer, right? And get better value to customer. And if they're aligned on their goals, what we began to find was they're aligned on a lot of the other underlying practices and principles within DevOps. So I'll talk a bit about the background, talk a bit about what is DevOps, what is Agile, and then I'll get into some of the places we compared them. Things like collaboration, a culture of learning, things like small batch sizes, continuous deployment, things like collaboration across teams, the ways teams work together in both Agile and DevOps. And we'll look at that. But first, you know, let's get a little history. Let's look at a little history here. I mean, one thing that's interesting to understand is there's a lot more interest in Agile and a lot more people know about it. It's been around a lot longer, right? And this is just a history of searches on Agile and DevOps. And obviously you see, you know, a lot more interest for a lot longer in Agile. And DevOps really only starts to pick up around 2012, right? And it's been growing ever since at a rate about, or maybe a bit more than Agile, right? So certainly it's much more recent. In fact, you know, Agile, and so the principles there of lean go back to the 1940s or even before, right? Where some of these concepts of lean manufacturing came into play, which were focused on really improving manufacturing pipelines. So it's really interesting when you look at lean and lean manufacturing as some of the basis of both Agile and DevOps, right? And if you're really interested in this stuff and want to geek out on it a bit, read The Goal by Goldratt and read The Phoenix Project. And The Phoenix Project is a kind of Gene Kim's updated version of The Goal. And it's really, I read The Phoenix Project first and then I read The Goal, and it's really cool to read them both because it's basically The Goal deals with manufacturing, and then Phoenix Project takes the same approach but talks about DevOps and the software development cycle. Anyway, sorry, a little, yeah, and it's, yes, and right, and they're both stories. They're both stories, almost parables, about, you know, fixing dysfunctionality and delivering for the customer. And so they're fun to read. And when I read The Phoenix Project, you'll read it and there's certain characters and you're like, yeah, I know that guy, right? We have him in our group. So in any case, so Kanban is as early as 1940s. Scrum comes into play around 1995. Now it isn't until 2001 that you get the Agile Manifesto, which is kind of the backbone of a lot of the Agile principles today. But still, that's 20 years old. DevOps Days then kicks off. The first DevOps Days in Ghent, I believe it was, is kicked off in 2009. So DevOps as a movement is now only about 10 years old. But it's been growing phenomenally, and for good reason. It brings a lot of value to the business. So one of the first things that I kind of asked myself, that we asked ourselves when we approached this, we're trying to define these, and we don't even know what kind of thing this is, right? Like, what kind of thing is DevOps? What kind of thing is Agile, right? Waterfall was the predominant development methodology for a very long time. And it's interesting to understand Agile in context of Waterfall, where you had delivery cycles that could be months or years, right? Where you took, half a year just to define what you were building, and then another 9 months to build it, and another 9 months to test it, which makes more sense if you're building a car or an aircraft or a CD, right? Because software used to come on CDs, right? And when you're shipping millions of CDs, you can't say, hey, push a update, right? So, right. Or if you're building, yes, a rocket, it's also hard to push an update to that, right? So it's understandable in a little bit of context. But we're talking about DevOps and Agile. And when we thought about this question, what kind of thing are they? We came to an answer, and I think you said it, that these are sets of principles. And they're both sets of principles which are focused on delivering value to the customer. So let's get into a little more on Agile. I think what I heard here was great, right? It's a way of delivering software. It's a set of principles. It's been around longer than DevOps. And a lot of the principles are defined in the DevOps Manifesto, which you mentioned. Which one did you miss?
Responding to change.
To change. So the Agile Manifesto laid out these four kind of principles: individuals and interactions over process and tools, working software over comprehensive documentation, customer collaboration over contract. And this doesn't say that we don't do these things, right? A lot of reaction against Agile was, oh, it's just an excuse not to plan. It's an excuse not to deliver on time. It's an excuse not to have a schedule. It's an excuse not to write documentation. But it doesn't say don't do documentation. It does say we're going to value working software over documentation. So let's talk a little bit about DevOps, right, on the other hand. Now, I think you folks actually defined it already. My personal, and the things I heard that were good there is focus on customer, delivering value, set of principles, right? My personal definition of DevOps is that it's a set of principles for delivering value to customer faster, focused on small batch sizes and collaboration. Now, there's a lot of principles under there, and we'll get into that in a bit more detail. But at its core, DevOps is about working together, right? And especially when you look back in Waterfall, right, you really had, okay, the business analysts do the requirements, the developers are going to build things, they're going to hand it off to the QA team who's going to fix all the bugs, who's going to hand it off to the customer, right? DevOps says, no, we got to work together, right? We got to work together better. And we're going to get value to the customer quicker by collaborating, which is a pretty wonderful thing when you think about it. And yeah, so in a lot of ways, I like to think of DevOps as an anti-pattern, right? Where you have these cultures where development builds things and then operation runs them, right? And they throw it over the wall, hope it works, right? And this is actually really problematic, can be really problematic in a lot of ways, right? Often these are different organizational units in companies. They're incentivized differently. So the developers are incentivized to produce more features more quickly. And operations teams are incentivized to keep things stable. Well, what's the number one cause of instability? Well, especially when you got a wall between them, it's change, right? So in fact, most companies, the average is about 60% of issues, production issues, are caused by change. So one team's going, change faster, and the other team's going, don't change, whatever you do, don't change, right? So at very best, you have, when you institute an organization like this, ensured handoffs, which ensure delay to your customer, because every handoff adds time and detracts from getting value to the customer. At worst, you've got two teams that are working in different directions from each other, right? Which is definitely not going to increase your time to market or your stability, right? So in a lot of ways, DevOps is an anti-pattern, is a reaction against that says, hey, look, if we can stop throwing things off the wall and work together, we're going to do better. There's a lot of, or there's a few different kind of paradigms. There isn't one definitive definition or set of principles like the Agile Manifesto. But in the Phoenix project, which I mentioned earlier, and in the kind of explanation of that, the DevOps handbook, there are laid out 3 different principles which come out in the Phoenix project as like, he gets this mentor who's kind of like this Yoda-like figure who kind of teaches him the 3 ways of DevOps. And it's interesting because he actually says, hey, look at this manufacturing problem that they've solved, and they take those learnings and apply them to operations and development. But the 3 different ways stand as one way of understanding DevOps. The first way being optimizing left to right flow. So looking at automated testing, looking at things like limiting your work in progress to ensure that things get through seamlessly. So reducing handoffs, another great example, right? The second way is about amplifying right to left feedback loops, right? So actually listening to your customers, right? Not just producing products because you think it's a cool technical challenge. And then the third way is about developing cultures of continual learning, right? And there's lots of ways we've done this. There's things like blue-green deployments where you deploy one set of features, and this is interesting from a product management perspective, where you you don't know if the customers are going to click on a green button or blue button. So you release the blue button to one set of customers and the green button to another set of customers, right? See who clicks on the most and then push that change out to everybody, right? So you ingrain learning into the systems you're building so you can learn immediately from your customers. There's other ways of doing this, like customer councils, like Chaos Monkey. I'll talk about some of this stuff in more detail, but basically building learning and testing into your system. All right. So that's a bit about DevOps. That's a bit about Agile. Let's look at how these overlap. So one of the main ways, and I've probably said collaboration 100 times already, that these overlap when you look at them is collaboration, right? And this was really introduced in Agile, right? Where you start to say, hey, Agile is shrinking your timelines. Remember in Waterfall, we had these 6 month, 6 year timelines, right? Say, now we want to do it in 2 weeks, right? Well, you can't do that if you're handing off from dev to QA, if you've got a 2-3 week test cycle, right? So you start to build these cross-functional teams where no longer do you have people siloed in different organizations, but you have these, what I like to think of as functional delivery teams, right? With QA and dev working together, right? And really that was needed for Agile. But what's missing here? Operations, right? So DevOps takes that concept and extends it and says, hey, it's not just about QA and dev working together. It's about QA, dev, and the people who actually run the thing working together. And we've got to be thinking about how this thing runs while we're building it. I had a great example one day. What was it? It was at Experian. The dev team was doing a show of what they had built, and it was a feature that allowed you to delay sending of a mail, right? And they're showing it, oh, this is great, and someone from the ops team says, how long can you delay it? And they say, however long you want. And they say, do you know that content is erased after 3 days, right? So they didn't realize that if they delayed it for more than 3 days, it wouldn't work because they weren't thinking about how this thing actually would run in production or the underlying underpinnings of the system. And so you've got to start to get operations in this development cycle and really have a full functional delivery team. This is a graphic from ThoughtWorks, and I believe it was Martin Fowler who said, DevOps isn't one team's job, it's everybody's job. And DevOps culture is all about shared responsibility. That means a shift towards transparency, communication, collaboration across development, IT operations, and the business. Another place we see, and someone said this earlier when they were defining DevOps and Agile, is about visibility, right? Transparency. And this kind of goes hand in hand with collaboration. Visibility, it isn't intrinsic in the Agile principles, but it is implied, right? When we start to talk about individuals and interactions, when we start to talk about customer contact over contract negotiation, when we start to talk about responding to change, there's an implication that we have visibility into that change. There's an implication that we have visibility into what we're building, right? And really the practice of Kanban, which is one way to do Agile, right? One implementation of Agile, really did then say, hey, we are going to make work visible, and we're going to do it by putting our work on boards and putting it up. And that can be Post-it notes on the side of the wall. That can be a Jira board. Even better, a Jira screen, which everybody can see. So everybody can see when work is blocked, right? Dominica de Grandis talked a lot about this and talks about limiting work in progress and that in process. And that basically means that if you're doing too much, you're not going to get anything done, right? So at our coffee ops, we have a limit to work in progress of 1, because we can only have one conversation at a time, right? But this is a great example of how making work visible in a Kanban board really exemplifies, you can quickly see where the problem is, right? And that's why so little is getting done. And so by limiting the amount of work in process, you're going to optimize that flow of left to right. And DevOps takes these concepts of making work visible and really extends them through a lot of the monitoring systems that are put in place to show how things are performing at a given time. When I was leading operations at Pearson, we had a program called Monitors Everywhere. And it was really neat. Every team had a big monitor in their area, right? And so you'd go over to the finance team and you could see how revenue was trending, and then you go over to the database team and you could see how many locks were on the database at a given time and how many, if they were doing re-indexing, and you'd go over to the support team and you'd see how many tickets were in their support queue, right? And you start to have the visibility to how the entire machine's working instead of just segmented pieces. And when you begin to share that information, there's a tremendous amount of power you can gain in the ability to deliver for your customer. And not just deliver as in, here's the software, right? I'm done with my job, but deliver as in, here's the running software and here's how it's running every day. Another key, and this comes from some of the concepts of lean, is also small batch sizes, right? And this, again, to go back, instead of looking at let's build, and this is fundamental to Agile, let's build the whole thing at once, right? It's let's build in small increments that are deliverable to the customer, right? And that's very important, right? So for our customers, we do 2-week sprints, right? And we deliver something every 2 weeks, and it may be a small something, certainly not a huge application, but by delivering value quickly, you limit what we were calling inventory, right? So you don't have a backlog of stuff that may actually cause problems, right? And you also get back to immediate feedback, right? So you amplify feedback loops, right? Because and you know what? Sometimes you deliver something and the customer says, no, that's not what I meant. In fact, most of the time you deliver something, but you haven't spent 6 months working on it to go, oh, that wasn't what you meant? Okay, let's roll. right? And again, from a product management perspective, this is really important, right? To get that faster feedback, to be able to then respond to it, right? And there are in Scrum, you've got sprints, which can be any amount of time, but we do 2 weeks. But it's also nice to be able to say if someone doesn't like something, we'll get it in the next sprint, right? If it's prioritized by the business and you have a backlog of things that people want, you put it at the top of the backlog, right? So it helps you get out of the conversation of, no, do this now, right? You don't have to wait 6 months. You don't have to wait 2 years. You have to wait 2 weeks. Can we do that? Usually you can. And so that's a much nicer conversation to have. And then you look at what's on the backlog for the next sprint, and you can have a civil conversation about prioritizing those things. All right, so we're seeing more and more stuff. As I'm going through this and looking at comparing Agile and DevOps, more and more ways these overlap. The more we dig into it, the more we see these things really come together. Another place these come together was continuous learning. Now, continuous learning has always been important to me. I'm a skier. I wasn't that skier, but I do fall a lot. But I fall because that's how I learn, right? Like, in fact, one of the first things I do, and this may sound crazy, and I'm actually a good skier. I don't fall because I'm a bad skier, right? But one of the first things I'll do when I get up on the slopes is try and fall, right? Because that tells me how good I'm doing that day, right? How fast I can go before I mess up, right? And every time I fall, I learn, and I get up and I can do a little better. And both Agile and DevOps take this principle of continuous learning into how they do things. And, in Agile, this can be in the form of sprint retrospectives. At the end of every 2 weeks cycle, you get together with the team and you said, what went well, what didn't go well, right? In DevOps, right, there's a lot of different ways this comes out and gets injected into the culture. Certainly, blameless postmortems. I worked at Etsy for a while. That was a big concept there. But the idea that when something breaks, it's not a bad thing. It's an opportunity for the company as a whole to learn. And if you can learn from that, it's actually really valuable. In fact, Etsy had an award called the 3-arm sweater, right? And the CIO would hand it out every year. And it went to the person who'd made the biggest mistake of the previous year. And it was actually kind of prestigious, right? Because when you look at it, what they found, what the researchers who have looked into these subjects have found, is that the people who are making mistakes are not willfully negligent, are not mean, do not hate their work or their organization. They're actually, by and large, the people who are doing the most work, who are doing it the fastest, and who are pushing the envelope of innovation. So if you punish those people by pointing blame, then you're really hurting the company as a whole by discouraging that sort of behavior and that sort of people, right? So to celebrate it and take each one of those as an opportunity for learning is really part and parcel of the DevOps process. All right, so another area that goes along with this is continuous testing, right? And this comes in with, Agile certainly introduced this. In fact, we were talking about this when we were doing Waterfall. But you want to find defects earlier on because it's way cheaper to find it up front, right? Especially just cognitively. If you're working on a problem and you're in the middle of it and someone goes, yeah, it's not working, you go, okay, let me fix it, right? Someone finds it 2 months later, you go, what the heck was I thinking? I don't even remember what I was doing 2 months ago. I don't remember what I was doing 2 weeks ago. So you introduce that in Agile, and also in order to get things out in 2 weeks, you can't have 2 weeks of development and then 2 weeks of testing, right? You have to be testing. And so you start in Agile seeing things like test-driven development, where you're actually writing test plans before you're building the software, right? And then once you build the software, you make sure that those test plans execute or the development fails, right? And DevOps takes this concept and extends it into the operations world, right? You mentioned Netflix. They have the Chaos Monkey, and they've expanded it to the whole simian army. But basically, the concept here is injecting failure, right? Because I think a lot of design is based on the idea that there's going to be this perfect world, and that's not the case, especially when the rubber meets the road, right? So you need to make sure you're designing for failure, and this says don't just design for failure, test your failure scenarios. And the idea of Chaos Monkey conceptually is like a monkey running around in your data center and pulling out cords, right? But pragmatically, they've developed code that essentially does that, right? So whether you're killing servers at random, whether you're launching a lot of processes at random, whatever it is, inject failure so that you can learn from that, right? First couple of times it might be painful, right? But it's a hell of a lot less painful to learn about it that way than to learn about it when it happens and it causes a major customer outage, right? So it's a key part of DevOps. So as we start to say, okay, we need to insert testing into our cycle, right? We need to make that part of what we do. We also start to need to insert operations in what we do. And there's a lot of different models, and we'll talk about that, about what that looks like, whether that means everybody does everything, or you've got a group of a multifaceted group of people like we saw on the functional versus organizational model. But more and more, you're probably hearing about this full stack engineer, maybe. The concept being that everybody who's developing has to be aware of the top to bottom. They can't just be writing code. They have to understand how it runs. And you can't just be a server admin. You have to understand the application that runs on that server. Now, I think there's a bit of a fallacy in the name. In fact, I think the concept that you can really have no specialization and just be a jack of all trades is like the unicorn. And I think ultimately there are people who have studied networking devices for 20 years and still don't know networking devices. So the idea that you're going to have someone who knows everything from the network stack to the application stack and the level of depth that they need to is not realizable, right? But there is a valid concept here that everybody needs to be responsible for the quality and operability of the system they're building, and not just the functionality of it, right? Because it's no longer sufficient just to build something that functions. It needs to actually function for your customers. Now, I mentioned there's a lot of different ways to organize, and one of the questions I get most often about DevOps, because we do DevOps consulting, is, what should my team look like, right? What's the ideal team shape for DevOps, right? And the answer is there isn't an answer. Right? There isn't ideal. There's a lot of different ways to organize for DevOps. There's certainly some ways that aren't good ways to organize for DevOps, right? Like the company that renames their ops team their DevOps team. That's not a good way to do DevOps. The company that has a DevOps team that's off in the corner doing the DevOps thing, also I would argue if fundamentally DevOps is about collaboration, having a collaboration team that doesn't talk to anybody, probably not the best way to do it, right? Ideally you want everybody doing Dev and Ops, right? But there's certainly, especially in large companies, evolves a need. There's going to be legacy platforms that are no longer have a dev team, right? So maybe you do need some guys who are just operating that software, because it's maybe we've had customers, they have a cash cow product, it's going great, it's making money. They're not going to update it, they're not going to be changing it. Why would you have a development team for that product? But you certainly need to make sure it stays running, right? So maybe now you do need some people who are focused on operations, and some people who are focused on developing new products that aren't operating yet, right? So there's certainly a lot of different ways to do it, few ways not to do it. All right, so there's a lot of different ways to organize for DevOps. I will say that some trends are emerging. This is from the State of DevOps, which is a great report on DevOps from 2018. Now, there's a couple of interesting things that this said. One, and I don't want to spend too much time on organizational structure, but I do want to point out that what this said was that 58% of companies still have large centralized IT teams. So we can talk about all this, but the fact is most companies aren't there yet. The other interesting thing in the yellow is where companies see themselves going. And this says that 39% of companies see themselves developing site reliability engineering. Now, a lot of people ask what's the relationship between site reliability engineering and DevOps. And I like to think of it as site reliability is a way to implement DevOps, or a implementation method of DevOps, right? A way of implementing it. So, and it's a job title as well, right? So a lot of people are going towards that. It's a model, popularized by Google. So interesting to see how these are available. So we thought about this and we thought about this, and where we started off looking for where are they the same and where are they different, what we came to is really they're not that different. In fact, if we go back to where we started, which is saying that the principles align, this isn't that surprising, right? Because if you're doing them for the same reason, it's not at all surprising that the way that's implemented has a heck of a lot more overlap than anything else. In fact, in some ways, I see DevOps as almost a natural evolution of Agile, right? Because it's really hard to do a 2-week development cycle if you have to then wait a week to get the guy to release the code, right? Because at the end of the dev cycle, it should be delivering value to the customer. It shouldn't be sitting in a repository waiting for your ops guy to release it, right? And you start to need to insert that operability into your pipeline, right? Include that in your development cycle. So especially as we see the cycles get shorter and shorter, what we see is that DevOps is really just a natural outgrowth and extension of Agile. It takes the principles, right, which were initially focused on building software, and extends it beyond the build into the operations and the running. I can't do a presentation on Amplify Agile with DevOps without at least one spinal tap reference. So, right, because if you use Agile with DevOps, naturally it goes to 11. DevOps extends Agile beyond the deployment pipeline. And if you're doing Agile, you really should be looking at DevOps, right, as a way to amplify that. And there are some strong numbers that back up that statement. This is from the State of DevOps from 2017, right? And what it said is that high-performing DevOps teams are doing 46 times more frequent deployments, 440 times faster lead time, right? So this means that when you want to get a product to market, high-performing DevOps teams are getting them to market so much faster, right? And the problem that's always happened there is that has meant so much more instability. That means your customers are faced with outages, right? But using DevOps with Agile bridges that gap. Because what they also found was that these same teams had 5 times lower change failure rates, right? And when changes did fail, it was 96 times faster mean time to recover. That means it fixed the problems in production 96 times faster. So they're not only moving faster, but they're more stable. And this has been what we've been after from a product perspective for a long time. Let's innovate and let's do it in a way that's beneficial for our customers. Using DevOps with Agile allows us to do that. So if you're looking at an Agile team, if you're looking at product management, look at how you can integrate these concepts into what you're doing. You know, look at integrating continuous testing. Make sure you're doing that. When you look at your team construction, make sure you've got operation and what we call the ilities ingrained in your delivery cycle. It isn't just about the function. It's about how are we going to manage and maintain that function? How are we going to support it? How performant is it, right? Look at how you can reduce the batch sizes and cycle time. Cut that down. If you're doing a sprint of a month, maybe you can do it in 2 weeks. In fact, when you're doing really good CI/CD, you can be doing hundreds of releases a day, right? Look at how we extend everybody. We had a great conversation at Coffee Ops the other day about specialization and on-call and how some people wouldn't be on-call. Well, if you change the mindset so we're all responsible not just for delivering features but delivering value to the customer, then really everybody should be on call because we all care about that. It isn't someone else's job. We're all the functional delivery team. Ultimately, if you're delivering product, you need to be thinking about not just Agile, but also DevOps and how they work together.